I knew my wife was lying before I knew what the lie actually was. That was the part that ate at me. After 36 years of marriage, I could still tell when something in our house felt off, and for the first time in my life, I stopped asking whether I was being paranoid and started asking how much I was missing. Diane and I got married at 22, right after college, back when we still thought hard work and loyalty were enough to carry two people all the way through life. She went into the Air Force. I built an insurance business. We raised two kids through deployments, transfers, school changes, late nights, and all the mess that comes with trying to build a family while life keeps moving the goalposts. I supported her through 20 years in uniform, and when she retired and moved into banking, I honestly believed the hardest part of our marriage was behind us. I thought civilian life would give us something back, more time, more peace, more room to be husband and wife again instead of two people managing schedules. That's not what happened. Her job at the bank started swallowing more of her life. At least, that's what she told me. 18 months before everything blew up, she started working late a few nights a week. At first, it sounded normal. Deadlines, reports, audits, staff problems. I didn't love it, but I understood it. Then the late nights turned into weekend conferences, and the conferences were always in places that didn't make much sense. She'd come home looking energized, not drained. That was the first thing that really stuck with me. Real work trips don't usually put that kind of shine on somebody's face. Then came the change with her phone. That one was impossible to ignore. Diane used to leave it on the kitchen counter, on the table, in the car cup holder, anywhere. Suddenly, it never left her hand. If we were eating dinner and it buzzed, she'd glance down, grab it, and step into another room. If I asked who it was, she'd say, "Work," in that clipped tone people use when they want a conversation dead on arrival. One night, I told her I felt like her job had moved into the house with us. She didn't talk it through. She snapped at me and said I didn't understand the pressure she was under. That was new too. Diane had always been composed. Defensive wasn't her normal setting unless she had something to defend. I kept trying to talk myself out of it. That's what a lot of people don't admit. When you've built your whole adult life around one person, your mind does everything it can to protect the structure before it accepts the damage. I told myself maybe she was stressed. Maybe I was reading too much into routine changes. Maybe this was just what getting older looked like when two people got too comfortable and too busy. But every red flag had a way of connecting to the next one. The late nights matched the secrecy. The secrecy matched the trips. The trips matched the distance that had been growing between us for months. The moment I stopped making excuses was when she mentioned a 3-day leadership conference in a city where her bank didn't even have a branch. She said it casually, like she'd already rehearsed it in her head. She gave me the dates, the hotel area, and a few generic details about networking and executive development. I nodded while she talked, but the whole thing felt wrong. Not vague. Not suspicious in some dramatic movie way. Wrong in the clean, polished, over-prepared way people sound when they expect questions and come armed with answers. That night, after she went to bed, I sat in the kitchen with my laptop open and checked everything I could think of. The conference didn't exist. Not under that name. Not in that city. Not on those dates. I checked banking associations, hotel event calendars, corporate listings, even local business journals. Nothing. By midnight, I wasn't dealing with a bad feeling anymore. I was dealing with a fact. My wife had looked me in the face and built a fake trip from scratch. The next morning, I called a private investigator. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask for another explanation. I didn't give her room to get better at lying. I met with a former detective named Marissa Keene that afternoon, and when I laid out the pattern, she didn't try to reassure me. She just listened, took notes, and asked for dates, habits, airports, credit cards, and anything else that could help her track movement. Her call made it worse in a way, because it told me I wasn't describing some rare misunderstanding. I was describing something she had heard before. When I walked out of her office, I already knew my marriage was in trouble. What I didn't know yet was how far Diane had gone, how long she'd been living this second life, or how much damage she was about to do before I finally saw the whole picture. For the next 2 weeks, I played dumb while Marissa set up the surveillance plan. That was harder than people think. It's one thing to suspect your wife is cheating. It's another thing to sit across from her at breakfast, hear her talk about normal things like grocery lists and branch staffing, and know there's a good chance she's building a fake business trip right in front of you. Every ordinary moment started to feel staged. Even the sound of her packing for that conference got under my skin because I knew now that every folded blouse and every travel bottle in that suitcase was part of a lie. To keep her from getting suspicious, I told Diane my company had scheduled me for a 3-day training on the same dates as her trip. That part wasn't hard to sell because insurance compliance training is boring enough that nobody asks follow-up questions. She barely reacted anyway. If anything, she looked relieved. That told me more than she meant it to. A wife who was really going away for work might have at least joked about how ridiculous it was that we'd both be out of town at the same time. Diane just nodded and moved on, like my absence solved a problem for her. I rented an Airbnb about 40 minutes from our house so I could stay close without being visible. The morning she left, she kissed me goodbye and gave me that same polished smile she'd been using on me for months. She told me she'd text when she could, but the conference schedule would be packed, so I shouldn't worry if she went quiet for long stretches. That line landed exactly the way she intended it to. It was preloaded cover for disappearing. I stood in the driveway and watched her pull away, with more luggage than anybody needs for a local 3-day work event, and I remember thinking that, whatever came next, I was never going back to being the husband I was 10 minutes earlier. About 2 hours later, Marissa called. She got right to the point. Diane hadn't driven anywhere near the city where the conference was supposed to be. She went straight to the airport and parked in long-term parking. That was the first clean break between her story and reality, and as simple as it sounds, hearing it out loud did something to me. Suspicion is one kind of pain. Confirmation is another. With suspicion, part of your mind still looks for a softer explanation. Once Marissa told me Diane was at the airport, that part of me died. Then it got worse. Marissa said Diane met a man at the departure area. Early 50s, graying hair, expensive suit, confident posture. They didn't greet each other like co-workers. They hugged, kissed, and stayed close in that easy, familiar way people do when they've done this before. Marissa sent me several photos a few minutes later, and I stared at them on my phone in that Airbnb like I was looking at somebody else's life. Diane wasn't nervous. She wasn't hesitant. She looked comfortable. Happy, even. That might have been the hardest part. There was no confusion in those pictures. No room for doubt. My wife wasn't slipping. She was fully in it. The two of them boarded a flight together, and Marissa kept following. By that evening, she confirmed they had checked into a luxury resort and were sharing a suite. The man paid cash. Marissa pointed that out because it meant this wasn't careless and it wasn't new. Cash, fake conference, vague itinerary, pre-planned silence. None of that comes together in a rush. This was organized. While I sat there trying to process 36 years of marriage collapsing in real time, Diane was checking into a resort with another man, like she'd done it enough times to know exactly how to move. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying the last year and a half in reverse, trying to figure out where the truth started and where the performance took over. Every late night at work, every weekend seminar, every time she turned her phone face down at dinner. Once you get proof, your memory turns against you. It starts relabeling old moments. Things you brushed off suddenly line up like evidence you should have seen sooner. By morning, I wasn't asking whether she was cheating anymore. I was asking how long I'd been funding a life I knew nothing about. Marissa called again the next day with more photos and a short update on their movements around the resort. Romantic dinner, poolside drinks, walking the property together like a couple on vacation. No urgency, no fear of getting caught. That was when something in me shifted from hurt to cold. I wasn't thinking like a husband anymore. I was thinking like a man who needed to protect his house, his savings, and whatever was left of his future before the person across from him decided to burn it all down. By the second afternoon, I had stopped hoping for some missing piece that would make the whole thing less ugly. There wasn't one. Marissa kept feeding me proof, and each update made it clearer that Diane hadn't stumbled into some emotional mess she didn't understand. She had built this. She had planned it, protected it, and rehearsed it enough to move through it without hesitation. The woman at that resort wasn't confused or conflicted. She was relaxed. That told me everything I needed to know about where our marriage really stood. That same afternoon, I started calling divorce attorneys. I wasn't dramatic about it. I wasn't rage-scrolling or looking for revenge. I was looking for competence. I wanted somebody who knew how to move fast, stay quiet, and keep a liar from getting ahead of me. While I was going through names and reviews, Marissa called with another update that changed the shape of the story again. Diane and her boyfriend had been joined at the resort by another couple. The other woman worked in banking too, though at a different institution. That hit me harder than I expected. It meant this wasn't just an affair. It was a whole social world built around deceit. They had friends in it, patterns, shared cover stories, maybe even a routine. On the final day of surveillance, Marissa called me from outside the resort and told me she had overheard enough to remove the last bit of doubt about whether this was new. Diane and the man, whose name we later learned was Cole Harlan, were talking casually about previous trips and making future plans. Not fantasies, plans. Dates, places, excuses. At one point, he mentioned his wife and kids in the same flat tone somebody might use to mention a utility bill. Marissa had managed to record enough audio to back up what she heard. That mattered because photos prove contact, but conversations prove intent. They weren't caught up in a mistake. They were operating a system. By the time Diane was supposed to be heading home, I had gone from devastated husband to silent witness. That doesn't mean I wasn't hurting. It means the hurt had hardened into something more useful. When she walked back into our house that evening, she carried herself the same way she always did after a trip. Relaxed shoulders, controlled smile, suitcase rolling behind her. She kissed my cheek, set her purse down, and started talking before I even asked a question. She told me the conference had gone well, that leadership training was a little dry but worthwhile, and that she'd made some useful contacts. She added just enough detail to sound credible. Industry terms, regulatory talk, a few names, a few references to breakout sessions and executive panels. It was polished, too polished. She'd built a script. I listened the whole time and didn't challenge a single word. That was the strangest part of the whole ordeal. Sitting in my own kitchen, hearing my wife lie to my face with complete confidence, and knowing I had photographs, timestamps, travel records, and audio that could dismantle every sentence coming out of her mouth. At one point, she even handed me a couple of business cards and said, "These might actually be good contacts for your side too." I took them, looked them over, and felt almost nothing. Marissa had already told me fake credentials were easy to buy online, and by then, I believed Diane was capable of putting any prop she needed into the scene. Later that night, while she unpacked, she casually mentioned that the hotel laundry service had lost one of her favorite blouses. That line stayed with me because it was so small and so unnecessary. Nobody had asked about missing clothes. Nobody was checking. She volunteered the lie because she was managing evidence without even knowing how much evidence already existed against her. That's what years of deception do to a person. It becomes automatic. They stop lying only when they're asleep. The next morning, I met with Elaine Porter, the divorce attorney Marissa recommended. Elaine didn't waste time trying to comfort me. She reviewed the file the way a surgeon studies scans before an operation. Photos first, timeline second, travel sequence, audio notes, written observations. Then she looked up and told me something I'll never forget. She said, "Most people show up with suspicion. You showed up with a case." That was the first moment since this whole thing began that I felt even a sliver of stability. Not because I was happy, because I finally had a direction. Elaine's advice was simple. File immediately. Stay quiet. Let Diane keep believing she was in control right up until the papers were served. The longer a deceptive person has to prepare, the more damage they can do. Move money, destroy evidence, coordinate stories, recast themselves as victims. Elaine wanted to deny her all of it, So that same afternoon, I signed the petition that would end our 36-year marriage. Then I went home, sat across from Diane at dinner, and listened to her talk about a trip she never took while the real consequences were already on their way. For the next 2 weeks, I lived in the strangest stretch of my life. On the surface, everything looked normal. Diane went to work, came home, talked about staffing problems and branch goals, and even started laying the groundwork for another so-called business trip the following month. Underneath that routine, the marriage was already over. I had filed. Elaine was moving things into position. Marissa was organizing the evidence. And I was sitting across from a woman who still believed she had me completely fooled. What made it so unsettling wasn't just the lying, it was how ordinary she acted while doing it. She'd ask me if I wanted chicken or pasta for dinner like nothing had changed. She'd remind me about a family birthday coming up. She'd make little comments about the weather, the yard, the grocery bill. Then, in the same evening, I'd catch her stepping into the hallway with her phone pressed low against her chest, speaking in that quiet, controlled voice she'd started using whenever work called. Once you know what's real, the whole house changes. The kitchen table isn't just the kitchen table anymore. It becomes the place where somebody looked you in the eye and lied without blinking. Elaine told me not to react to any of it. She said people like Diane usually make mistakes when they think they're safe. So I stayed steady. I didn't accuse her. I didn't snoop in some obvious way. I didn't let anger push me into a speech I'd regret. Instead, I kept copies of everything in a locked folder at my office and waited for the right moment. Diane took my calm for ignorance. You could see it in how relaxed she was getting. She had no idea the trap was already built around her. She thought she was still writing the story. The plan was to have her served at work. That part mattered to Elaine because Diane's entire second life depended on presentation. She cared about control, image, professionalism, and appearing composed in front of other people. Serving her at home would have given her privacy. Serving her at the bank would strip that away. It would force the truth into the one place where she had spent years managing impressions. I didn't come up with that strategy on my own, and I'm not going to pretend I did. But when Elaine explained it, I agreed without hesitation. Diane had used her job as cover for this affair. It felt right that the cover would be the first thing to crack. On a Tuesday morning, the process server arrived at her branch with an envelope marked legal documents. Her assistant signed for it and took it straight into a conference room where Diane was meeting with 2 employees. That's what the service report said later. The envelope contained the petition, the surveillance photos, transcripts of key conversations, and a clean timeline showing exactly where she had been and with whom. There was no vague accusation in that package, no room for confusion. It was built to hit like a wall. Marissa had positioned herself nearby and later told me Diane opened the envelope, saw the first airport photo, and immediately lost color in her face. Not dramatic in some movie way, more like her body just stopped cooperating. She started flipping through the pages faster and faster, and by the time she reached the resort photographs, everyone in that room knew something serious was happening. Diane left the conference room and rushed to her office, but by then it didn't matter. Panic moves fast in a workplace. Silence moves even faster. People notice when the person who usually controls everything suddenly can't control her own expression. While that was happening, I was at my office taking a call from a client about a policy renewal. That contrast still stays with me. One half of my life was collapsing in a bank office across town, and the other half was sitting at a desk talking calmly about coverage limits and deductibles. Elaine called that afternoon and confirmed service had been completed without any issue. Then she said the part that really landed. Now she knows you know, and she knows you planned for it. That was the first time I felt something close to relief. Diane called me that evening. Her voice was shaky and thick, like she'd been crying for hours. She started with, "Russell, this is a misunderstanding," which told me she had learned absolutely nothing. Not remorse, not honesty, not even a decent lie anymore, just panic. I listened for about 5 seconds, long enough to hear the fear in her voice, and then I hung up without saying a word. After everything she'd built behind my back, silence felt more honest than anything either of us could have said. Once the papers were served, everything started moving faster than I expected. Diane hired an attorney within days, which didn't surprise me. But what did surprise me was how quickly her side stopped acting confident. Elaine told me early on that strong evidence changes the tone of a case before anyone even gets to a courtroom, and she was right. Diane could lie to me in my kitchen. She couldn't lie past photographs, travel records, audio, and a documented timeline that matched every piece of it. Her attorney knew that, mine knew that, and before long, Diane knew it too. The first real shift happened when financial disclosures started. That's when all the secretive behavior she thought she had contained started bleeding into other parts of her life. Elaine had already warned me that people carrying on long-term affairs usually don't just lie emotionally, they lie logistically. Money gets moved around, trips get disguised, purchases get explained away. Sure enough, once accounts and statements were pulled, the picture got uglier. There were spending patterns that didn't match the story of occasional work travel. There were hotel charges, cash withdrawals, and odd gaps around the same weekend she had claimed to be at conferences or training events. Some of it couldn't be directly tied to a specific trip, but it didn't have to be. It showed a pattern. That pattern mattered. Cole's identity also came into full view faster than Diane probably expected. Marissa had already given us enough to work with, and once one thread got pulled, the rest came loose. He was married, had children, and had been living the same kind of double life Diane had. His wife got hold of the evidence, and from what Elaine later told me, that marriage detonated almost overnight. Their joint accounts were frozen. Lawyers got involved. Custody became an issue. What struck me most wasn't satisfaction. It was how much damage two selfish people could do while telling themselves they were just chasing happiness. They hadn't just betrayed spouses. They had built a whole system that depended on humiliating the people who trusted them most. Diane kept trying to reach me during the early months. At first it was calls, then emails, then long messages that bounced between apology, blame, confusion, and self-pity. In one message, she said she never meant for any of this to happen, which was such an absurd thing to say that I read it twice just to make sure I wasn't missing something. None of this happened by accident. She invented conferences, packed bags, booked flights, met a man at an airport, shared suites, came home and lied smoothly over dinner. People always want to describe betrayal as a mistake when they get caught. But a mistake is taking the wrong exit off the highway. This was a routine. I stopped reading after that. Our kids took it hard. Tyler called me first, confused and angry, not really at me, but at the speed of it all. From his perspective, his parents had gone from married to divorce papers with no warning. Hannah was quieter. She cried on the phone and kept asking if there had been any chance to fix it. I told both of them the truth, carefully and without dragging them into the dirtier parts. Then, when they were ready, I let Elaine provide enough of the documented timeline to make it clear this wasn't a misunderstanding or one bad choice. Both of them admitted later that they had noticed changes in their mother over the last couple of years. More distance, more guardedness, more excuses. They just never imagined where it led. They chose to keep a relationship with both of us, which I respected, but something in their view of Diane changed for good. You could hear it. By the time we got close to the final hearing, Diane looked worn down in a way I had never seen before. Not humbled exactly, more like somebody who had spent so much time managing appearances that she didn't know what to do once appearances stopped working. The confident branch manager, the composed former officer, the woman who could walk into a room and control it with tone and posture. That version of her was gone. In her place was somebody smaller, more frantic, and far more ordinary than the person I had spent decades admiring. I wish I could tell you that seeing that made me sad. At one time, it probably would have. But by then, I was too far past the lie to mourn the performance. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for closure, protection, and one clean ending to a marriage that had been rotting behind the walls long before I finally saw inside it. The final hearing happened 11 months after Diane was served at work, and by then there wasn't much left to argue about. The evidence had done what evidence is supposed to do. It cut through performance. Elaine had structured everything around documentation, timing, and financial protection, and that strategy paid off. Diane's attorney pushed for a cleaner split than I was willing to accept, but once the court reviewed the record, especially the proof of the affair and the money surrounding it, the tones shifted fast. Diane was no longer walking in as a long-term wife asking for sympathy and support. She was walking in as someone whose own conduct had wrecked her credibility. The judge awarded me the house, a stronger share of the savings, and a meaningful portion of the investment accounts. Diane was held responsible for her own debts and legal fees, and the support she probably expected never materialized. Elaine argued that her misconduct had directly affected the financial and legal posture of the marriage, and the court agreed enough to make a real difference. When the hearing ended, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. That was enough. After almost a year of living in facts, filings, and fallout, steady felt like a luxury. Diane's life kept unraveling after that, not because of anything I did beyond ending the marriage, but because people who build their lives around deception usually don't keep the damage contained to one area. Her job at the bank didn't survive the scandal. Whether they called it reputational risk, bad judgment, or loss of confidence, the result was the same. She was out. The woman who had once managed the branch and carried herself like she had every detail under control ended up moving in with her sister and trying to patch together a much smaller life with a much smaller paycheck. Cole's situation got ugly too. Once his employer started looking at his finances, questions turned into audits, and audits turned into serious problems. I later heard that both of them ended up facing legal trouble that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the way they handled money and other people's trust. The strangest part of all this is that the affair stopped being the biggest betrayal in my mind. What stayed with me more was the structure of the lie. The rehearsed stories, the fake work trips, the confident smile when she came home and told me about a conference that never happened. The calm way she sat at our dinner table and talked to me like I was too blind to catch any of it. That's the piece that changes you. Not just finding out somebody cheated, but realizing they could live beside you for years while managing two realities at once. Once you see that, you stop thinking in terms of one bad decision. You start thinking in terms of character. Our kids eventually found their footing. Tyler and Hannah both kept contact with Diane, and I never tried to interfere with that. She is still their mother, and that relationship belongs to them. But they also saw enough to understand why I drew a hard line. There was no dramatic confrontation in the kitchen, no screaming match, no final speech, just proof, action, and a door that closed one legal step at a time. Looking back, I'm glad it happened that way. Some endings don't need more noise. They need clarity. I won't pretend this experience made me wiser in some clean, inspirational way. It made me more careful. It made me less impressed by appearances. It taught me that time invested is not the same thing as truth earned. 36 years can still hide a lie if the person living it is committed enough to the performance. But it also taught me something else. When the truth finally shows up, you don't have to collapse with the life that hid it. You can act. You can protect yourself. And you can leave with your name, your sanity, and your future still intact. If this story hit home for you, I'd really appreciate it if you liked the video, shared it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribed for more real stories like this one. It helps the channel more than you think, and I'm grateful you stayed with me through the whole thing. I'd really like to hear what you think. At what point would you have stopped trusting Diane? Would you have hired a private investigator or confronted her earlier? And do you think serving her at work was the right move, or did Russell go too far?